Hello friends, new week, new MCQ. And this week I had put up a general physiology MCQ. It was a tricky one. It was a tough one. Let's see what was the MCQ and what I meant when I asked this MCQ. Let's see the answer. Which of the following can be described as feedback feed forward type of homeostatic regulation? So this MCQ was related to the homeostatic regulatory mechanisms. Basically there are two types, feedback and feed forward, and in feedback there is negative and positive feedback. So we all read the mechanisms to be clearly either feedback or feed forward or negative or positive feedback. But uh, there was some catch in this MCQ. There was some trick. Let's find out. So the options were homeothermy, so temperature regulation, and thereby regulating the overall interior, or hemostasis, uh, that is arrest of bleeding after the injury, and calcium homeostasis, or increase in the heart rate and respiratory rate with isotonic muscular exercise. These were the options. Many students said an interesting MCQ. They couldn't find the answer in the conventional books. So let's find out what I meant here by feedback feed forward type of homeostatic regulation. The answer, of course, was homeothermy, regulation of temperature, body temperature. And why it can be called feedback and feed forward both, and that too first feedback and then feed forward. Now look, basically when we talk of temperature regulation, uh, first we must understand that there are two types of body temperature: the shell temperature, or let's say skin temperature or surface temperature, and core temperature. Core temperature is a critical one, because core temperature is the temperature surrounding our cells. Core temperature is in our body tissues, and this has to be kept constant under all circumstances, because it is the cell which is functioning, and therefore temperature around a cell should be held constant. So core temperature has to be kept constant under all circumstances, and that is the main purpose of the homeothermy, or body temperature regulation. The shell temperature, skin temperature, or surface temperature, or the outer temperature, it can vary. It does vary with the surrounding temperature. So let's understand how the things work. Let's say we enter a cold environment. The skin temperature will begin to drop. The shell temperature will begin to drop, and the blood temperature will also begin to drop. Now this decrease in blood temperature, it will be conveyed to the hypothalamus. Our temperature regulating center is in the hypothalamus. So hypothalamic thermostat will be made aware that the temperature has deviated from the set point, and then hypothalamus, particularly the posterior hypothalamus, it will induce shivering, and the temperature will be brought back towards normal. Temperature will be increased and will be brought back to the normal. Now this is classic negative feedback, because the body temperature, shell temperature had begun to drop, blood temperature and body temperature had begun to drop, but then there was a possibility of drop in the core temperature as well, as a result of dropping blood temperature. That is avoided, that is prevented. Okay, decrease in the blood temperature happened, or it begins to happen, and then it is anticipated by the regulator, that is hypothalamus. Now that's a danger of a drop in the core temperature, and it's not at all acceptable. So it takes the action in a negative feedback fashion by shivering. In this case, it increased the body temperature. Temperature was brought back to normal so that the core temperature remains unchanged or unaffected. So you can see here that shell temperature and blood temperature were regulated as negative feedback. There was a deviation, and that deviation was negated or cancelled out, and the temperature was brought back to normal. But this has acted as a positive, or rather it has acted as a feed forward for the core temperature. I mean, you know what is feed forward. A disturbance is anticipated, and even before that disturbance could happen, the controller takes the action, corrective action. That is feed forward. So controller took the action in a feed forward manner to avoid change of temperature in the core, or the cell, I mean tissue temperature, core temperature was kept constant. It was not allowed to be changed in a feed forward fashion, and therefore this can be labeled as feedback feed forward type of regulation. Temperature regulation can be called as feedback feed forward because one is regulated in a feedback manner in order to take action in a feed forward manner for the other one, which is actually a critical or very important one. So that was the answer to the MCQ that I asked this week. Let's quickly also go through the other options. Let's try to understand why the other answers, other options are not fitting the bill. Hemostasis. What's your opinion about hemostasis? Well, hemostasis can be called as positive feedback, negative feedback type of regulation. Yes, it can be called positive feedback, negative feedback regulation. Let's understand why. Let's say there is a rupture to the blood vessel and bleeding starts. Now, platelet plug formation occurs and it stops the bleeding. This platelet plug formation is an example of positive feedback. More and more of the same goes on happening. Few platelets are activated, they adhere to the vessel wall, they release certain chemicals. So some more platelets come into that area, they adhere to the previous ones, they are activated, they release chemicals, then more and more platelets come into that area. So platelet plug formation stops the bleeding, and platelet plug formation is an example of positive feedback. But then bleeding has occurred, some bleeding, and then the platelet plug formation takes place. So blood volume changed little bit maybe, but blood volume decreased. Then over a period of time, that blood volume will be restored and will be brought back to normal. So there was a decrease in blood volume because of the bleeding, and it was corrected over a period of time by the body mechanisms, by pulling in the interstitial fluid or other mechanisms, by retaining sodium and water. So blood volume will be restored, which means it's a negative feedback. Blood volume dropped a little bit because of the bleeding, and by corrective action it was brought back to normal, which is a negative feedback. So hemostasis can be labeled as positive feedback, negative feedback. First there is a positive feedback to stop the bleeding, and then there is a negative feedback that will restore the blood volume. Calcium homeostasis, it can be straight away called as the negative feedback, although there is some hint of feed forward also in this. That anticipating that the bone calcium might reduce, the action is taken by in the form of parathyroid hormone and vitamin D. But calcium homeostasis by and large can be called as a negative feedback. Only when the calcium begins to drop that the PTH will come into effect, parathyroid hormone, and it will increase the blood calcium. So negative feedback and possibly feed forward in order to avoid any more changes in the serum calcium or body's calcium pool. Increase in heart rate and respiratory rate with the muscular isotonic exercise. What will you call it? Well, this is feed forward feedback. The question was feedback feed forward. The last option, increase in the heart rate and respiratory rate, can be called feed forward feedback. Why? Look, when you start an intense, moderately intense isotonic muscle exercise, just at the start of exercise, the heart rate and the respiratory rate increases. Now, this is classic feed forward mechanism. You know, this is happening in anticipation that the muscles are now going to need extra oxygen, and therefore, as a preparation of that, as the exercise begins, just at the onset, there is going to be increase in the heart rate and respiratory rate, and this is feed forward. Then later into the exercise, 3 to 4, 5 minutes into the exercise, heart rate and respiratory rate continue to rise. Now this is negative feedback, because let's say because of the exercise, carbon dioxide was generated, more carbon dioxide, excess carbon dioxide and H plus was generated. Now this needs to be thrown out of the body, and that is why heart rate and respiratory rate continue to rise. Breathing continues to be stimulated so that the CO2 and H plus is washed out of the body. So increased CO2, ventilation stimulated, CO2 washed out and brought back to normal. That's a negative feedback. So start of exercise, feed forward, and well into the exercise, feed back. That is how we can describe the increase in heart rate and respiratory rate with the muscular exercise. So, this was a tricky one, and you won't find answers to such questions in your conventional books, but this requires some amount of thought process. So inspiring such a thought process was the idea behind asking this MCQ.